The pocket knife blade was worn thin from years of use, but as Hector scraped desperately at the rusted lock mechanism, he could hear the water level rising behind him in the tunnel. 5 hours of wading through sewage and toxic waste had led to this moment. Standing waist-deep in filth, Tri picked a lock that separated him from freedom while his friend Luis floated face down 20 feet away. The guide who'd promised them safe passage through the underground route had vanished, leaving them trapped in a system designed to flush waste, not preserve human life. The plan had seemed foolproof when Carlos, the self-proclaimed tunnel expert, explained it 3 days earlier in Tijuana. The sewer system that ran beneath the border was a relic from the 1940s, built when the boundary between Mexico and the United States was more fluid. Old pipes connected to older pipes, creating a network that predated modern surveillance technology. For someone who knew the routes, it offered invisible passage beneath the most heavily monitored border on Earth. Hector had saved for 8 months working construction in San Salvador, every peso hidden from family members who would have prevented his departure if they'd known his intentions. The gang violence that had claimed his older brother was escalating, and witnesses to their crimes were disappearing regularly. America represented his only chance to survive long enough to build a life worth living. The underground route was expensive but supposedly guaranteed. Luis had joined the plan through desperation rather than choice. His 14-year-old sister had been kidnapped by MS-13, and the ransom demanded was beyond anything his family could raise through legitimate means. He needed American wages, needed them quickly, and couldn't afford the luxury of safer but slower border crossing methods. The sewer tunnel represented his fastest path to earning money that might still save his sister's life. Carlos had been convincing during their initial meetings, showing detailed hand-drawn maps of the tunnel system, explaining water flow patterns and drainage schedules. He claimed to have guided dozens of people through successfully, never losing anyone to discovery or drowning. His price was steep, $6,000 per person, but included equipment guidance and emergency assistance on the American side. Everything seemed professionally organized. The equipment Carlos provided was basic but functional. Waterproof bags for documents and money, battery-powered headlamps, rope for maintaining contact in dark passages, and plastic bottles containing purification tablets for drinking water found underground. He stressed the importance of following his instructions exactly, warning that deviation from established routes could lead to areas where rescue would be impossible. They entered the tunnel system at midnight through a maintenance access point in a Tijuana industrial district. The initial passages were concrete-lined storm drains, relatively clean and spacious enough to walk upright. Carlos moved with confidence through intersections and branch tunnels, his headlamp cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow their voices. Everything proceeded according to plan for the first 2 hours. The transition from storm drains to actual sewage pipes came gradually, the smell intensifying before the reality became visible. By the 3rd hour, they were wading through ankle-deep waste, breathing through cloth masks that provided minimal protection against a toxic atmosphere. Carlos assured them this was temporary, that cleaner passages awaited ahead. The promise kept them moving when instinct demanded retreat. Navigation became increasingly complex as they penetrated deeper into the system. Carlos consulted his hand-drawn maps frequently, sometimes backtracking when passages didn't match his expectations. The tunnels seemed to shift and change, as if the infrastructure had been modified since his maps were created. What had appeared straightforward on paper proved labyrinthine in reality. The water level began rising during their 4th hour underground, not dramatically, but consistently enough to suggest systematic change rather than temporary fluctuation. Carlos explained that drainage patterns shifted based on usage above ground, that morning activities would increase flow temporarily. But his explanation sounded less confident than his earlier assurances, and Hector noticed him checking his watch more frequently. Luis started showing signs of distress as toxic fumes accumulated in poorly ventilated sections. The purification tablets couldn't neutralize everything they were breathing, and prolonged exposure was affecting his coordination and judgment. He stumbled repeatedly, catching himself against tunnel walls slick with substances better left unidentified. Carlos urged him forward, insisting they were close to emergence, that fresh air awaited just ahead. The betrayal revealed itself suddenly and completely during a rest stop in a wider junction chamber. Carlos claimed he needed to scout ahead for potential obstacles. He took his equipment and maps, promising to return within 15 minutes. An hour later, with water levels continuing to rise and no sign of their guide, Hector and Luis understood they'd been abandoned in a system they didn't understand, following routes they couldn't navigate alone. Panic set in as they attempted to retrace their path. But the tunnel system that had seemed straightforward, while following Carlos, became impossibly confusing without his guidance. Every intersection looked identical in the narrow beam of their headlamps. The rising water eliminated landmarks they might have remembered, and the toxic atmosphere was affecting their ability to think clearly about navigation decisions. Luis collapsed first, overcome by a combination of toxic exposure and the psychological pressure of being lost underground. Hector tried to keep him conscious, sharing his remaining water and offering encouragement that sounded hollow in the echoing tunnels. But Luis's condition deteriorated rapidly, his responses becoming incoherent, his movements uncoordinated. The sewer system was claiming its first victim. When Luis stopped breathing, Hector faced a terrible choice between staying with his friend's body and continuing alone toward uncertain escape. The water was rising faster now, suggesting that surface drainage was increasing with morning activities above ground. Staying meant drowning alongside Luis. Leaving meant abandoning someone who'd trusted him enough to follow him into this underground hell. Hector chose survival, a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. He took Luis's headlamp and rope, said a prayer over the body, and continued through tunnels that seemed designed to confuse and trap rather than transport. Every step forward was a step away from his friend and toward a freedom that felt increasingly undeserved. The weight of abandonment followed him through the darkness. The locked grate appeared after another hour of desperate navigation, a barrier he hadn't expected at what should have been the exit point. Carlos had described the emergence as a simple climb through an unlocked access, but this grate was secured with a heavy padlock that showed recent use. Someone had modified the exit, possibly Carlos himself, creating a trap that eliminated the possibility of unauthorized emergence. The water was now chest-deep and rising steadily, turning the tunnel into a gradually filling tank with limited time before it became completely submerged. Hector's headlamp revealed walls that offered no handholds for climbing above the waterline. The locked grate was his only possible escape route, and the pocket knife was his only tool for attempting to defeat a lock designed to prevent exactly what he was trying to accomplish. Working underwater required him to hold his breath while manipulating the knife blade inside the lock mechanism, surfacing periodically to breathe air that was becoming increasingly toxic as water displaced oxygen in confined space. Each attempt provided only seconds of work time before the need for air forced him back to the surface. Progress was measured in tiny increments against a timeline that was rapidly approaching zero. The lock mechanism was old but functional, designed to prevent casual intrusion rather than determined escape attempts. Hector's construction experience had taught him basic mechanical principles, though applying them underwater while fighting panic and toxic exposure pushed his abilities beyond anything he'd previously attempted. The knife blade found purchase in the lock's internal mechanisms, slowly working against springs and tumblers that had rusted into partial solidity. As the water level reached his neck, Hector realized this might be his final attempt. The airspace above the water was barely sufficient for breathing, and the toxic concentration was approaching lethal levels. His movements were becoming sluggish, his vision blurring from chemical exposure. The pocket knife represented his last connection to survival, its worn blade the difference between emergence and drowning in sewage waste beneath the border he'd never successfully crossed. The lock yielded suddenly, its mechanism finally surrendering to persistent manipulation. The grate swung open into blinding daylight that burned eyes accustomed to hours of darkness. Fresh air rushed into the tunnel, displacing toxic gases with sweet oxygen that tasted like salvation itself. Hector pulled himself up and out of the system that had nearly become his tomb, collapsing on American soil that felt foreign and unwelcoming despite representing everything he'd risked to reach. But emergence brought new problems rather than solutions. He'd surfaced in an industrial area of San Diego, covered in sewage and obviously foreign to anyone who might observe him. His documents were intact in their waterproof container, but his appearance marked him as clearly as any official label. The underground journey that was supposed to provide invisible entry had instead delivered him to the surface in a condition that announces illegal status to anyone within sight or smell. Finding shelter required avoiding populated areas where his appearance would attract unwanted attention. He spent his first day in America hiding beneath an overpass, trying to clean himself with bottled water purchased from a convenience store, where the clerk's expression suggested immediate suspicion about his customer's background and recent activities. The freedom he'd paid $6,000 to reach felt more like exposure than liberation. The psychological impact of Luis's death became clearer as shock wore off and reality settled in. He left his friend's body in a tunnel that might never be discovered, might serve as tomb and monument simultaneously. Luis would never earn the money to ransom his sister, never see his family again, never know whether his sacrifice had purchased anything more valuable than Hector's survivor guilt. Immigration status remained precarious despite successful border crossing. Being in America without documentation was just the first challenge in a process that could take years to resolve, if resolution was even possible. The underground route had delivered him to his destination, but provided no assistance with the complex legal and practical challenges that followed. Carlos had sold transportation, not transformation. Employment opportunities for someone without legal status were limited to cash-only work that asked no questions about background or documentation. Hector found instruction jobs that paid below minimum wage, lived in overcrowded apartments with other undocumented workers, sent money home when possible, while saving toward uncertain futures that might include deportation regardless of current circumstances. The pocket knife remained his possession, a tool that had literally saved his life, but also represented the moment when survival had required abandoning someone who trusted him. Sometimes he'd hold it while thinking about Luis, about the sister who'd probably died waiting for ransom that would never come, about the family that would never know what had happened to their son and brother in the tunnels beneath the border. Nightmares came regularly, featuring rising water, locked grates, and Luis's voice calling from behind as Hector continued forward alone. The dreams always ended the same way, with emergence into blinding light that provided freedom but not peace, survival but not salvation. The underground journey had taken more than it had given, even though it had delivered him to the country he'd sought to reach. 3 years later, Hector learned through immigrant networks that Carlos had been arrested for human trafficking, though not in connection with sewer tunnel operations. His business model involved abandoning clients in dangerous situations, collecting fees for services never fully delivered. The tunnel maps had been fabricated, the successful crossings invented, the professional appearance carefully constructed to attract victims who would be unlikely to survive long enough to expose his methods. Other migrants shared similar stories of guides who disappeared at critical moments, of tunnel systems that became death traps, of locked exits and rising water levels. Hector's experience wasn't unique, just one variation in a pattern of exploitation that turned desperation into profit and human life into acceptable losses. The underground routes were graveyards disguised as pathways, attracting people who had no safer alternatives. Luis's sister had been found dead 2 weeks after their tunnel journey, her body dumped in a San Salvador neighborhood as a message to other families about the consequences of involving police in gang business. The ransom money Hector had hoped to help earn would have been irrelevant anyway, collected by criminals who never intended to honor their agreements. Luis had died underground pursuing salvation that was already beyond reach. The construction work that sustained Hector in San Diego involved building homes for families who would never know their houses had been constructed by someone who crawled through sewage to reach their country. The irony wasn't lost on him. Creating American dreams for people who'd inherited them legally while living his own dream in shadows, always aware that discovery could mean deportation to dangers he'd fled years earlier. Documentation remained elusive despite consultations with immigration lawyers who explained the complex process of regularizing status for someone who'd entered illegally. His case had no special circumstances that might qualify for asylum or special consideration. He was simply another economic migrant who'd taken illegal action to reach a country that offered better opportunities than his homeland provided. The sewage smell never completely left his memory, returning during stress or illness to remind him of hours spent breathing toxic air while wading through waste. Sometimes he'd catch similar odors around construction sites or industrial areas and feel momentarily transported back to those tunnels, back to the rising water and locked grate, and the terrible choice between staying with Luis's body or continuing toward uncertain freedom. Community organizations provided support for undocumented workers, but Hector remained cautious about involvement that might create records or attract official attention. His survival depended on invisibility, on existing below the radar systems designed to identify and remove people like him. The successful border crossing had made him American in location, but not in legal status. Present but not protected, years of sending money home had helped his family improve their situation. Though they never learned the true cost of his American employment, he told them he'd crossed safely, found work, was building toward eventual legal status. The details about Luis, about the tunnels, about the locked grate and desperate knife work. Those stories stayed buried like the friend he left behind in passages that might never give up their dead. Sometimes Hector would drive past storm drains and sewer access points, wondering about the people who might be underground at that moment, following guides who might abandon them, trusting maps that might be false, carrying hopes that might drown in rising water. The system that had nearly killed him continued operating with new victims, new promises, new disappearances that would never be fully investigated. The pocket knife had been sharpened and resharpened over the years, its blade worn even thinner by constant use in construction work. But its most important function had been that single underwater lock picking session that had meant the difference between life and death, freedom and drowning. No amount of subsequent use could match the significance of those desperate moments when metal had scraped against metal in pursuit of survival. His American life was real but constrained, successful but incomplete. He'd achieved his goal of reaching the United States and finding employment that paid enough to support himself and help his family. But the legal vulnerability remained constant, and the psychological cost of Luis's death colored every success with reminders of the price paid for opportunity. Freedom had come at the cost of innocence and friendship. Immigration raids at construction sites created periodic panic among undocumented workers, sending everyone scrambling for hiding places or alternate exits. During these moments, Hector would think about the tunnel system, about the false promise of invisible routes, about the reality that there were no safe passages for people like him. Every border crossing method carried risks that could prove fatal. The locked grate had been replaced with newer security measures. Hector discovered during a return visit to the emergent site. The access point was now sealed with welded steel, eliminating the possibility of using his route for future crossings. Carlos's operation had been shut down not by law enforcement, but by infrastructure improvements that made the tunnels inaccessible. Progress had eliminated the pathway, but new routes would emerge to meet ongoing demand. Luis's family eventually learned he had died attempting to cross the border, though they never knew the specific circumstances or location. Hector considered contacting them to share what he knew about their son's final hours, but realized such knowledge would only add to their pain, without providing comfort or closure. Some stories were too difficult to tell, even when silence felt like betrayal. The construction work continued, building America one house at a time, while carrying memories of the underground journey that had made such work possible. Each foundation poured reminded him of the infrastructure hidden beneath surface appearances, the systems that moved waste and water through passages most people never saw or thought about. He knew those hidden spaces in ways that marked him as forever different from those who never needed to navigate them. His story had no clean ending, no moment of resolution that transformed the underground ordeal into meaningful narrative. He'd survived when Luis hadn't, emerged when his friend had drowned, escaped when circumstances could easily have killed them both. The randomness of survival haunted him more than the horror of the experience itself. The knowledge that being alive was accident rather than achievement. The pocket knife remained in his toolbox, a reminder of the night when a simple blade had been the difference between life and death, between drowning in sewage and breathing free air. Sometimes other workers would borrow it for construction tasks, unaware they were handling an instrument that had once picked a lock underwater, while toxic waste rose toward a ceiling that offered no escape. The tool had saved one life while failing to save another, a mixed success that reflected the complexity of survival itself.